Christianity has a lot of nuances to it and some stereotypes that come with that. And there are stereotypes all across the board for most anything. But from a faith standpoint, one of the stereotypes we have is that Christianity, we have legalism. We have all these lists of rules that we don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And we avoid this, avoid that. And that's one of the reputations that we have. And in fact, a lot of times, people who are outside of the church say, well, Christians can't have fun, or they can't do these things. We're not allowed to do these types of things. And what we find is that in the Old Testament, we have the law, and specifically the Ten Commandments. And that's where we're going in this series. We're going to look at the Ten Commandments. But the law is this external list of rules. The law was literally written on stone tablets. But it's a list of rules that's external, and the Apostle Paul talks about how the law can only tell us when we do what is wrong. But if we just stop at this external list of rules, we're going to find a religion that is often dissatisfying, that can be oppressive, that can be overbearing at times. But if we connect this to Jesus, then we have a faith that's real, that moves us, that feeds us, that fills us. And so what we're going to do when we look at the Ten Commandments, we're going to move from stone to flesh. We're going to move from this external list of rules to a heart change. Because if you remember in Ezekiel chapter 36, 25 to 27, Ezekiel talks about this. And this is what God is saying. He says, I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. Your filth will be washed away, and you will no longer worship idols. And I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit in you. I will take your stony, stubborn heart and give you a tender, responsive heart. And I will put my spirit in you so that you will follow my decrees and be careful to obey my regulations. Ezekiel prophesied what God was going to do through Jesus with the Holy Spirit. We're going to take this external list of rules and we're going to write it on your hearts. And we're going to give you the Holy Spirit, so it's no longer I have to try harder. It's the Holy Spirit that empowers us to live the life that Jesus has called us to live. That's where we're moving towards. These external list of rules from stone to flesh. And that's where the Ten Commandments come in. And as we think about the Ten Commandments, we have to first and foremost start with, what do we worship? What do I worship? What is most important to me? You may remember in Acts chapter 17, Paul encounters this pantheon of gods, and there's this altar to the unknown God. Because what happened in the ancient world, they were so paranoid that they would forget a God, so they would have an inscription, the altars to the unknown God, to cover our bases, to make sure we don't get smited by somebody because we didn't know about them. See, in the ancient world, they were always willing to add one more deity to their list. What's one more? Let's just add them. No big deal. And this is one of the reasons Christianity was persecuted in the early church, because they wouldn't add another God. They just had Jesus. Jesus is Lord, as opposed to Caesar is Lord. So that was a big deal. That was a big shift for Christianity in the ancient world. But if I say we're going from the stone, this external list of rules, to the heart, to the Spirit writing the law on our hearts, to a flesh following of Jesus, why do we need the law? Can't we just get rid of it? Can't we just do whatever feels right to allow the Spirit to do that? I don't know why I always want to come back to the book of Judges, but everybody is doing what is right in their own eyes. Read the book of Judges. It's terrible. Destruction, sinfulness, all over the place, because everybody was doing what is right in their own eyes. So the law, as the Apostle Paul tells us, and it can only tell us what was wrong, but because of the law, we're able to understand what God wants from us. We're able to understand what God is calling us to do. And so when we break God's law, what we're actually doing is we are challenging God's sovereignty. I don't have to listen to you. I can do my own things. Try doing that in our legal system today. Try going to court and standing in front of a judge and say, I'm going to do whatever I want. The judge is going to say, no, you're not. right? Because the judge is in complete control. And if we defy the judge, then we are questioning his control. But see, if we disobey God, what we're saying is, you are not in control, I'm in control. I can do whatever I want. There's nothing you can do about it. But when we think about the Ten Commandments, the first one is about idolatry. And we have this image in our mind about idolatry, particularly in the Old Testament. And why I bring that up is because oftentimes we look at the idolatry in the Old Testament and say, well, that's not us. We don't worship the golden calf. We don't melt down our metals to create a new object for us to worship. But we have idolatry in our world today. And one of our idols is that of identity. And this is not a new thing. You remember, our identity, we find identity in things like our job title, or the amount of money in our bank account, or our spouse, or our kids, or just what we accomplish at work. We find our identity in all those types of things. Now, in the last 5, 7, 8, 10 years, identity has become a new thing. We're talking about sexual identity and those types of things. But identity is not a new idol. It's something that's always existed. It just manifests differently at different times. But we come to Exodus chapter 20, which is where we find the Ten Commandments. We find them also in Deuteronomy chapter 5, but Exodus 20 is the more well-known one because there's more context of the story of Moses climbing the mountain and all those interactions. But Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 is where God begins this section. He says, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. Now that's a really important place to start. When we're talking about the Ten Commandments that God is going to bring, he starts by affirming who he is. I'm the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. If we forget that, then the list becomes just a list of rigid rules. But there's a relationship established here. Because for 400 years, Israel was enslaved to the Egyptians. They were living in bondage for 400 years, and so God is reminding Israel of history. Now, this has only been a few weeks, maybe a few months later. It had not been a long time, right? It's not it was not years or decades or centuries that had passed. It was a relatively short time that they had been enslaved. And God reminds them of that and reminds them that he intervened. They were delivered from slavery. And this is the basis that God establishes for his relationship and rule over the Israelites. I have chosen you. I delivered you from slavery. Now, there is a history of God providing for Israel, starting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then taking them to Egypt to save them, and then delivering them from Egypt. And God has identified them as his own. Now, if you remember, the ancient world had a lot of different deities. And Egypt was no exception to that. Egypt had countless deities. And so for 400 years, Israel had been immersed in this culture. Now, they had their own separate area where they lived, but for the most part, we see that they were influenced by the theology of Egypt for 400 years. And the reality is, you can't mix worship with God with anything else. If you try to mix worship of God with something else, it's going to distort your worship of God significantly. It's going to make it not be meaningful or have any value whatsoever. But for 400 years, Israel was in Egypt, and so there was at least some level of cultural assimilation. If you live in a culture for long enough, you're going to get used to some of the customs and practices. And when you think of the number of people, of Israelites that were there were likely a lot of them that actually succumbed to that way of thinking, if we're thinking statistically likelihood. But the reality is, God is either your top or he's not. He's either the most important thing in your life or he's not. And if he's not the most important thing in your life, then you have a priority problem. You have an issue with how your life is structured. But as I was looking through this and reading about it, I came across the concept of the theology of the ancient world. Because we tend to view, there's two extremes. Polytheism, which is the belief in many gods or even countless gods. There's just a bunch of gods. And then monotheism, which is the belief in one God. And so we have polytheists and monotheists, but there's this group in the middle that we don't really talk about too much, and they're called, it's henotheism. So we have polytheism, henotheism, and monotheism. And what henotheism means is that each nation had their own supreme deity. And so I believed in your God, and you believed in my God, and it was a matter of whose God is the strongest is going to determine who wins when we fight. And so there's a progression there, but the Israelites were on the extreme. Really, nobody else had the belief in one God except the Israelites. And so they moved past that, but they still had to continue to fight against polytheism and henotheism as they continue to develop as a nation and as a group of people. But God rescued them. He establishes that fact. He comes back to them, I am the Lord your God, the one who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. God rescued his people. And they were about to take possession of the promised land. Now, if you know the history, they had to wander in the desert for 40 years, so it was a little longer than they were anticipating. But for the fact of the matter is, they were about to enter this land that was inhabited by people who did not serve Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, the name of God in the Old Testament. They were about to conquer this land, inhabit it, and God is saying, remember, I am the Lord your God. Remember who I am, because if you forget me, bad things are going to happen. You're going to compromise. God says you must recognize me as sovereign. God is not like any other gods. He's not going to stand in a line for you to pick which deity you want. It's not like it's a Sunday bar where you can add certain toppings or not. God says, I am the Lord your God. We have to start there. But we like to pick and choose. We like to have control. And we can see our desire for control in entertainment. Some of you remember way back in the dark days that when you wanted to rent a movie, you had to get in your car and drive down to Blockbuster or Family Video and hope that nobody else had rented that video. It's awfully disappointed when you see the VHS cover and there's no tape behind it, right? Remember those days? I barely do, but I remember them. And then we progressed to Redbox, where it was a vending machine, right? Great. Oh, sorry, I forgot. We progressed to DVDs, so you didn't get penalized if you didn't rewind the tape when you took it back to the video store, right? But then we had Redbox or vending machines to be able to rent videos. But now, if I have to get up off my couch, it's not a movie worth seeing. If I can't find it on one of the streaming services that I subscribe to, I can download it on demand and watch it there. You know, it may cost me a few more dollars to do it that way, but it's from the convenience of my couch. Because I want it now. I want to choose it. I want it convenient. I don't want to have to sit through commercials. In fact, if I have to sit through commercials, I'm like, oh, the horror today, right? But those are the reality. I remember when DVRs first came out, and I realized I could pause the show, go do a few things, whatever, get supper ready, whatever it was, come back, play the show, and then I could fast forward through the commercials, right? You know, God bless America. But that's how we function, right? We want to be able to pick and choose. If I want it, I should be able to get it now and on my terms. And we can talk about anything, whether it's entertainment, whether it's our desires and pleasures. We want it now. We want instant gratification. That is a modern form of idolatry. It's about serving myself. But after God reminds Israel that I am the Lord your God, he goes on to give the first commandment in Exodus 20, verse 3. You must not have any other God but me. Pretty short, pretty simple. Nothing too complicated or extreme about what's being phrased here. It's brief. No other God. Can't worship anything but me. Now, if we obey the first commandment, if we have no other God except Yahweh, except God, then all the other 9 commandments are going to naturally follow. But if we get this wrong, all the other 9 are out of place. We're going to have certain things wonky here. If we forget Exodus 22 and 3, if we forget that He is the Lord our God who rescued us, if we forget the fact that we are to have no other God but Him, then everything else gets out of whack. See, God doesn't want to share His glory. He wants us to worship Him intimately. God is our top or He's not. He's either our one and only or He's not. And we see these concepts throughout Scripture. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, it says, you must fear the Lord your God and serve Him. Right? That is what we are called to do. We're to fear Him. He is the Lord our God, and we are to serve Him. Nobody else. Jesus quotes this in Matthew chapter 4, verse 10. He's in his temptations. Satan is tempting him, and Jesus says, you must worship the Lord your God and serve Him only. So we see the Old Testament says we need to do this. The New Testament says this is really, really important. See what happens if we don't follow this? We begin to drift. Slowly and slowly and slowly we begin to drift and drift and drift. I think King Solomon provides one of the most vivid examples of what happens when we compromise and drift. Solomon was the wise king. He knew everything. He's known even today for his wisdom. He had all sorts of wealth. He built the palace, the temple. But yet, as you see his life goes, he got further and further and further away from God. And what happened is he married those who didn't follow God. He had 300 wives, 700 concubines, and he got further and further and further away. And the result was that after Solomon died, the kingdom of Israel split, and it went through a civil war, essentially, because he didn't stay faithful to God. There were consequences that happened. Because he got his foundation wrong, there were logistical things that came up. So I want to ask you, what do you love? What things in your life say, I love this? Or even, what do you trust? What are the things you place your trust and hope in? Because God is not, He's not a tolerant God. He is intolerant. Now, in certain ways, He's gracious. He's merciful. If we mess up, He wants us back. He will forgive us if we repent. But God doesn't tolerate sin. If we worship something other than God, He does not tolerate that. Jesus tells us in John chapter 14, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's only through Jesus. If we don't have Jesus, then we've got things out of order. But when we talk about things we trust, when you get into trouble or have a problem, an issue, minor or major, where do you go? Where do you turn to for solutions, for help? Do you turn to yourself? Do you turn to others? Do you turn to God? Where do you turn? Because we have to be careful that we don't worship ourselves. We have to be careful that we don't take God out of the equation, which is where modern idolatry really creeps into our life. Particularly, we can see it with our material things, that we find happiness and fulfillment, joy, worth in what we have, whether we're talking about our bank account, whether we're talking about our cars, our homes, our gadgets. Now, I have a question for you. If you have a cell phone today, did anybody intentionally, now if you're a child or a teenager and your parents said you had to, that's not intentional, did anybody intentionally leave their cell phone at home today? Okay, I see three people intentionally did. I think three. That means everybody else didn't. It's really weird when I forget my cell phone at home and I go somewhere else. It's really weird if I leave my cell phone and I walk away. We're attached to this. We can't live without this thing. It's called idolatry, isn't it? If I can't live without this, it's that I'm worshiping this thing. I'm a slave to this thing. This thing is controlling me. And we just have to be careful. Now, cell phones can be good. There are good aspects of it. I'm not trying to say you should get rid of your cell phone. But the fact of the matter is we have to recognize the things in our life that try to get between us and God. But as I said, we got to connect this to Jesus. What does Jesus say about this? And we can come to Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 35. So a Pharisee who was a religious expert in the law came up to Jesus to try to trap him with this question. He said, "Teacher, what is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind." This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. So this was a common setting, even though the religious leader was trying to trip Jesus and trap him. This was a common practice. They would have these religious debates where they would do one of two things. They would take the law and they would either try to condense it down to the most simplest of statements or expand it and make it as broad and endless as you can get and have nuance after nuance after nuance explained. So they would either condense or expand the law. And so this religious leader comes to Jesus and is asking him, which is the most important commandment? So in this instance, he is asking Jesus to condense the law. Make it as simple, as brief as you possibly can. So on some level, we have to make sure we answer this question before we move on. If we want to get past this concept of our faith is this legalistic rule-based system, we have to be able to ask the question in its simplest form, what does it mean to follow God? What do we have to do? What is the most important commandment? And the most important one that Jesus identifies is that we love God with everything we have. But there's the second side of things, and if we love God, we're going to love others. And so those two work hand in hand. So we begin with God. Everything about who we are as followers of Jesus begins with who God is. We love God and we love everyone. It's the most important thing. To see God as either your top or He's not. He's either the most important thing in your life or He is not. So we look in our world today, and while the atheistic population is probably growing, most people believe in some type of deity. And most people who aren't religious are probably agnostic, which means, well, they don't deny the existence of God, but they just haven't found God yet. And so most people have this thought process, this understanding, but they don't want to give their life to this deity, whoever they think it may or may not be. In fact, there are a lot of followers of Jesus who struggle with that. I believe in Jesus. Do I have to give everything? Do I have to give everything to Him? And I've heard multiple stories about missionaries who go into these parts of the world where the name of Jesus has never been proclaimed. And they say a lot of people they encounter are willing to follow Jesus as long as they can keep their other gods, as long as they can keep the other things they worship. They're willing to add Jesus to their lives. They just don't want to get rid of anything else. How many Christians are that way? I want to add Jesus, but Jesus, don't take that from me. I want to do that. I want to be involved in that. I don't want that to be taken from my life. Now, just because we can condense the law, the expectations of God, into two rules of love God with everything and love your neighbor as yourself, doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean it's something that's simple. But it also means we can't separate it. We can't separate the Ten Commandments and say, well, we don't have to do this one, or we'll work on this one later. The Ten Commandments is a list of this is what it means to follow God. See, the Ten Commandments, some can say that they list them as two different types of categories. Categories 1 through 4, commands 1 through 4 are the commands of my relationship with God. Have no other gods before me. We can't have any other gods. We don't take His name in vain. We remember the Sabbath. So we do those things. Commands 5 through 10 are interpersonal relationships from person to person. Number 5 is honor your father and mother. So that's parent and child. The 6 through 10 are don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't covet. Of my relationship with somebody else, whoever that may be. And so we see both sides of what Jesus is saying. We see that reflected in the 10 Commandments. We love God with everything. We love our neighbor as ourselves. We will fulfill this. But Jesus and God call us to complete and sole allegiance. Now we talk about God as a jealous God. He's not a paranoid tyrant who's ready to thwart any threat that comes his way. But he's a jealous God, meaning he's not going to let you have anybody else. And sometimes we get really uncomfortable with that. But if we think about a marriage relationship, you're not going to marry someone and then let that person have somebody else too. That would be odd. That would be weird. That would be uncomfortable. That would be unhealthy. God's saying, I'm your top or I'm not. I'm the one you want or I'm not the one you want. And we can say with the family analogy here with modern idolatry, as we idolize family. God, I got this thing over here. I've got family events. I've got these things. I'm going to do all these things. So I don't have time for you right now. We're so worried about our family, our kids, our spouse, our parents, our siblings, whoever it may be, that we kind of push God out of the equation. But one of the things that's interesting is that I started with verse 2 today because that sets the tone for the 10 Commandments. Verse 2 is not one of the commandments. I'm the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. What God is affirming is that if this is true, if I'm your God, and you are my people, then actually what's going to happen is that these 10 Commandments are going to happen. See, another way to translate the 10 Commandments is different than what we grew up with. Most of us grew up with the 10 Commandments of thou shalt not. You don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But if we start with verse 2, and if verse 2 is true, that I'm the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. If that's true, then another way to translate it from the Hebrew language is not thou shalt not, it's that will not. Now, maybe that doesn't mean different. It's meaning that this is the result. That's where I'm getting at. The result is if I serve God, the result is that I will have no other gods but him. If I serve God, it means I'm not going to steal. If I serve God as my one and only, he is the top, then I am going to live a life that honors him. So we can look at the 10 Commandments and say, well, it's this list of things we can't do. Or we can look at the 10 Commandments and say, that is the God I serve. That is the God who has rescued me from my Egypt. He has delivered me from bondage. I am free. He is the one I serve. And if he is the one I serve, these things are going to happen. This is going to be the result. So we can look at the 10 Commandments as this external list of rules that make it so we don't get to have any fun. Or we can view the 10 Commandments as this list as a result of what happens because God has delivered us. That's our choice. See, the world looks at it as, well, it's this list of don't do's. It's this list of you can't have fun. But if God is our top, it changes how we behave. It changes our actions. It changes our attitudes. It changes what we do. You know, the great thing is, if God's not your top right now, he says, come to me. God says, let's change that right now. You don't have to wait. And God isn't saying, let's change that so I can make you feel bad about yourself. He says, let's change that and let's start something new. We have to have the humility to recognize that, though. Because there may be areas in your life where God hasn't been the top that he's supposed to be. And if we can live our lives pretending that everything's okay, or we can come to him and say, Jesus, work in me. Because I don't care where you are, Jesus isn't done with you. There's more that Jesus has for you. He wants to do more in your life. Are we willing to do that? I think part of it comes down to the question of how in love with God are you? Is God just this thing that you rely on to help you give a pickup every once in a while? To make you get an emotional high? Or is He your everything?